Perfect. So, hello everyone, and welcome to this conversation on understanding emotional trauma and its impact on mental health, mental well-being for LGBTQ Africans and those in the diaspora. I am Ade Adeniji, and for this section, we're going to be having a conversation with Pierre Bouard. And we're going to be talking about trauma care, and hopefully looking at support as well relating to trauma. So a little bit about myself before I ask Pierre to introduce himself. I'm Ade Adeniji. I'm a coach, facilitator, consultant, mental health first aider. Currently in the Netherlands as we where we're recording this, and I live partly in the UK as well. And I co-run an organization in the UK which works with gay men, helping gay men explore the things that get in the way of their past and helping them live their best lives. And some of the research that we use in that work is based on the work of Dr. Brené Brown. Some people listening to this might be familiar with her work, and she does a lot of work around shame, vulnerability, empathy. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation, Pierre, and why don't you introduce yourself?
Great, thank you, Ade, and hi to the audience who may be watching this. This feels like quite an exciting conversation to be having, and I think it has a nice intercontinental, intertextual flair about it. So I'm a psychologist, a clinical psychologist by training, and I currently work in a center based at the University of Pretoria, which focuses on sexualities and HIV and gender. So our work is theoretical and intellectual research work, but it's also about what makes institutional and community spaces safer and easier and better for people who may be diverse around sexualities and gender. So for example, I've been working on trying to develop a guideline for our university to work with trans and gender diverse staff and students as a very practical example of the kind of thing that I would do. But I'm also involved in work that is around transformation and diversity, work around privilege, whiteness, race, racism. In fact, this morning I was involved in co-facilitating a discussion amongst about 15 school teachers who have experienced a pushback from their students of color around a range of microaggressions and other experiences that have made the school feel hostile to them. And so we had a sort of guided conversation around what's going on and what do they need to do and be that is different to make the school feel more inclusive. So I think there's an interesting overlap, perhaps in some ways, in our interests and work.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy to be here. Thanks.
Wow, that's really very rich. Sounds like you've got your hands in so many pies, as it were.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I started my working life, which I think is pertinent to this discussion around trauma, in HIV. I started out as a volunteer in the sort of middle 1980s, which ages me just a tad, as in a small sort of gay helpline, and then it turned into something more around HIV work, and then as I qualified, I formally moved into the field. And I do think a lot of looking back on the epidemic in South Africa and perhaps other countries too, is to think about it as an experience of trauma, not only for the individuals who were diagnosed in the early years of the epidemic, when there were no, I mean, I can remember a time when there were no tests, then there were no treatments, and then there were very few services aimed at anybody, but particularly LGBTIQ people. And I think that was, in a way, a kind of a collection of individual traumas, but also collective trauma that happened to queer people, and particularly gay men, I suppose, who were some of the early people who were infected with HIV. So yeah, sort of looking back sometimes, I think that the queer community, or certain aspects of the queer community in South Africa, experienced that as a traumatic exposure, which has, I think, longer term consequences.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that often comes up for me when I am, I guess, talking to people about trauma is, why is it important? Why do we need to talk about it? This is such a dark, sticky subject. Why don't we just move on? And at the same time, I recognize that it's really important. And one of the quotes I often refer to is, I think it's by Jack Cornfield, the Buddhist teacher, who said, the pain of the past is often held in suspension until we are ready for it to find us. It's that notion of the past is never dead. The past is always playing out in the present. And that's why I feel it's important that if we don't really revisit the past and try to heal the stuff from the past, it's going to keep on showing up in different ways in the present. And I'm wondering, why do you feel this is important, this discussion around trauma?
Yeah. Well, you've kind of led me in very beautifully to my own thoughts, which is, obviously for individuals who've experienced trauma of whatever kind, unless it has been well processed or there have been opportunities to heal, it can have lifelong consequences, which are psychological in terms of one's sense of self, interpersonally in terms of being able to relate to other people, to have intimate relationships that are substantive or comfortable. There are health consequences, in terms of illness, physical illness, repeated and long-term exposure to trauma and stress, can actually affect a person's physical health and make them possibly subjected to stress-related illnesses. And this is quite well documented around racism as well, for example, repeated exposure to it. So there's all those kinds of consequences, I think, that make it feel, not only is it psychologically an important thing to, but perhaps even morally, it is the right thing to do for a society to offer, to recognize that trauma is damaging, and that it affects persons' well-being and affects their place in a community and society and their ability to contribute and be a fully functioning, healthy and happy person. So I think that's one of my first thoughts is that, harms are real. And if we take the sort of a queer LGBTI, angle on it, in the African context, there are so many ways in which queer people are exposed to harm, sort of the political, legal, social, economic, cultural, religious climate is often deeply hostile to queer people. So, it's almost impossible to escape the sense that you are other or undesirable. So it never goes away. It's there because it's your identity that is a part of that conversation. So we if you recognize that, I think then it means we need to do something about it.
Yeah. There are going to be some people who are watching this, listening to this, who at this point might be going, what is trauma? What does it mean? People use that word left, right, and center. And I used to think that it was just for those big things that happened, So in Nigeria, there was the Biafra War, which happened around about the time that I was born. And that was something that people referred to. People talk about 9/11. People talk about these big things, the killing of George
or the Rwandan genocide.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I heard Gabor Mate, the Canadian, physician, talking about trauma. And one of the things that he said, which I really loved, He said, trauma is what happens inside us as a result of what happens to us. So something happens, an event happens, what's happening inside. And I really liked that because when I was growing up in Lagos, Nigeria, the emphasis was always on the external, what was going on outside. And there was never really any conversation around what was going on in my inner world and how I was dealing with that. And I think that really compounded my trauma. And when I speak to a number of my friends who are from different parts of Africa, still living out there or living in the diaspora, they also talk about that, the fact that no one ever talked to them about what was going on inside of them.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, I mean, if you think about, classic definitions of trauma, it's an external event that impacts on you in ways that overwhelm your coping abilities. And depending on your ability to process that, you can have longer term consequences, so physical and emotional. But I also think, you've made me think about how in many communities and families, there's this idea that as long as that some of the internal stuff isn't important to talk about, because as long as you have a roof over your head and you're fed and you're clothed and you've got an education, and all those sort of external building blocks of what appears to be a functioning human, that's sufficient. But I'm thinking about my own life. My father passed away when I was 6 years old. And I think at that time, and even maybe to some families today, you don't talk to children of that age about the loss because it is assumed they don't experience it, because they often don't have the verbal ability to express the sadness or the confusion or the panic that they might be feeling. And so I was never given the opportunity to process that loss. And it came back to bite me over and over and over and again until I really did the work in my sort of middle to late 20s onward, when I for the first time, I really experienced the sadness of that. And it left other very long-term consequences. So I think of that loss as a trauma for me, and I wasn't given the opportunity to process it. So one thing that I think about is when I'm waiting to meet people, a friend who's coming to meet me at a restaurant, for example, and they're running late, my first instinct is to think something bad has happened to them. They've had a car crash and they're dead. Because I was never given, I suppose, a language to understand that something that was happening, my father was dying behind closed doors, left me thinking that if you don't tell me what's going on, something bad is going on. And so I will always leap to something terrible has happened. And that has affected me my whole life. I'm 61 next month, and it's still with me.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the William Faulkner quote, the past is never dead, it is not even past.
No.
It's a very bleak quote, but it's so true. I mean, listening to that example around what's going on internally for us, and and how we navigate that as we grow older. I know for myself, when I started to recognize that I was gay, there was no one to talk to about it. So I'd go to church, and every so often the pastors would talk about the abomination and about men lying with each other. And so there was all this external stuff that was going on. And internally, there was no one to say, actually, Ade, you are loved, you are welcome here, you are not broken, you are not damaged. And I still see that, not just in different parts of Africa, but different parts of the world where, when it comes to people who are LGBTQ being persecuted in different ways and being told that we are not enough. So there is the external stuff, the collective stuff, stigma stuff, and then there's the internal stuff that we all still navigate in our own ways as well.
That's so true. You know, because I suppose as we're talking, I'm thinking the word trauma can be used quite casually, you know, and maybe there might be a sort of a more technical definition for some things that are more extreme in their nature, you know, because sometimes we might say, oh, I was traumatized, I missed the bus, you know, and you kind of think, well, is that really traumatic? Unless the buses have some deep significance for you. But I think what queer and LGBTI people have to contend with is that the constant exposure to that sort of negativity from a very young age means that when things do happen to you that are quite intense and traumatic, perhaps your resilience is less. And if you already have a sense of a damaged sense of self, or you've internalized those negative ideas and the shame and the embarrassment and the humiliation and the less than-ness, I guess it's possible that your ability to withstand that traumatic event might be less. And even after that trauma has passed, you're still facing homophobia and transphobia and other forms of discrimination.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't believe that any of us are free until we're all free. So, you know, every single person, whether they're LGBTQI, until everyone, regardless of where they are, is being welcomed, honored, celebrated.
Yes, yeah.
It still has an impact on each person, regardless of where they are. So I'm currently here in the Netherlands, where, you know, people who are gay have pretty much the same rights as straight people. And yet, when I pick up the papers or go onto social media and I see something happening in a different part of the world, it still resonates. It still touches that old trauma within myself that goes, ooh, actually, I still don't feel I'm good enough. I still don't feel I'm worthy because someone out there, just like me, is being persecuted.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Two thoughts that popped up for me when you were talking is that when no one is free, I'm not free until everybody else is free, made me think about the fact that sometimes we visit harm upon each other within the LGBTI community as well. You know, and that is something that I think is important always to reflect on, is that, you know, from a South African perspective, you know, there are white queer people who are racist, you know, or as gay men we can be sexist or transphobic if we're cisgender. So I think that's important sort of work on ourselves that needs to happen. There was another thought that I had, but I think it left my head as you were talking. So maybe I'll come back to it if it comes to me.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about what you just said, actually, in terms of, that pain, that sort of, you know, we're hurting and we're causing pain as well. And I'm thinking of that phrase, you know, hurt people, people. Yeah. And I'm wondering whether that is to do with trauma. Because if I don't love myself, if I don't feel I'm good enough, you know, I might want to disassociate from that, which is one of the impacts of trauma.
Right.
And hurting someone else might make me feel better. I mean, it doesn't really in the long run, but in the short term, some people might be doing that unconsciously, I wonder.
That's true. In a way, part of what happens when trauma happens is there's this sort of hyper arousal at a physiological level, because the body goes into this sort of fight or flight or freeze or even collapse mode. And there's a very intense sort of memory scheme that is set up of that. And sometimes, I suppose, technically it is argued that one hasn't then developed those sort of a higher order memory of that event, which makes sense of intellectual sense of what went on. So sometimes we get stuck at that sort of sensory hyper arousal level, which can be a soothing place to go to in a funny sort of way. You know, so maybe the idea of hurting other people brings up some of that stuff arousal stuff that is part of the triggering of that trauma experience. But I remember what I also wanted to say about something earlier was that you said something about reading about traumatic events happening to queer people in other parts of the world, for example. I don't know about you, what sometimes I find is that I start to go into that physical arousal state, which I think is often one of the signs of trauma, which is I can feel my blood pressure going up, my heart rate increases, my breathing might change, and I feel flushed with anger and hurt and rage. And, it's such an interesting visceral response, which I think is somewhere in the trauma story. And I sort of feel like I've got to do something. If I read about Chechnya, in ways in which queer people are lured to online hookups or other things where they get killed. Or I read in our own continent here, stories of lesbian women being raped, or blackmail, or public humiliations in a village. I go into that hyper-arousal state that I sort of almost don't know what to do with myself when I go there.
Yeah. The body is such a powerful system that can very easily become activated in situations like that. I mean, that is one of the signs of trauma, and there's a lot of research that shows that that emotional trauma, reading something in a newspaper, watching something online, still has that visceral impact on the body. I guess one of the things that's coming up for me right now is there a difference between being in Africa and how trauma might be playing out and how people navigate that to people who are in the diaspora? And the image that was coming to mind for me, so I speak in a lot of metaphors, and this is another metaphor.
Me too.
The metaphor of the pill, this pill, which is like a fence, which is like a system that is enclosed. So in different parts of Africa, they are the communities. It's very communal. So I know for myself, when I'm in Nigeria, it's not just about me and my parents. It's about uncle, aunties, cousins. They are this extended family. And this notion of the pale is everyone needs to collude, conspire to stay within the pale. And if you try to leave the pale, you're shamed. So for people who are othered, who are different, who are marginalized, for whatever reason, many of them sacrifice their authenticity because they want to belong. As human beings, we're wired for connection. So if I'm a gay man living out in Nigeria, I might think I'm going to get married to a woman because that is the way that I'm going to get the love of my community. So I stay within the veil. My trauma gets heightened because I'm not really living at my core. But out here in the diaspora, which is very much individual, I don't need to worry about the pale. I'm my own individual. I can go out and self-actualize. And so my trauma plays out in a very different way. And so it's a very interesting one. I'm not sure what your views are on that.
Probably as complex as yours are, it would appear. I mean, you've made me think about friends of mine, living in Nigeria to some extent, and in Kenya. A particular friend, a Kenyan friend of mine who came to study in South Africa as a gay man, and has qualified with a PhD, went back to live in Nairobi, and the pressure on him around marriage is relentless. It is a source of great distress to him because he's sort of now in his early 30s, and the the confusion in his family and broader communities. Why are you not married? You know, because marriage is a marker of being in the pale. You know, it's desirable, it's socially, communally desirable that you marry and have children and be part of the community. And he even avoids going home to his family village to visit his older parents because he says he just can't stand the relentlessness of the questions. And then sometimes I say, well, you should say to them, you're not going to talk about it, you know, and you refuse to go to that topic. And I realize that I don't understand what it feels to be like in that space where other people feel entitled to have an opinion on your marital state, and they believe you should play your part by being married. So I think that's a very real thing. And I think it makes you also think about, you know, what would healing look like in those different contexts. I suppose a part of me wants to say, I'm sure there are other communal societies around the globe where these notions apply as well, not just in Africa. But I do think it's a very real thing. And, you know, and I was thinking in preparing for this conversation, there's that often people in our continent are rejected by the very institutions that give them meaning. You know, their family, their faith community, for example, their cultural norms and practices that you are being marinated in from babyhood and are part of your meaning. But those same institutions are sites of harm, like you talked about the messages from a pastor that you are, you know, Satan's work, for example. And that's a very difficult space to be in because you're constantly being exposed to negative messaging, but you desire and crave the acceptance of your family and your church and your community. And so it's almost inescapable in some ways.
Yeah, yeah. And yet the trauma conversations are not really happening across the continent in that sense. I mean, there's a lot of emphasis around the legislation. Let's have the laws and let's change the institutions. And as I'm listening to you, and I'm thinking, gosh, all this stuff is happening. And internally, the stuff that our brothers and sisters are going through in terms of this sort of disassociation from self. In order to survive, it's not even about thriving. In order to survive, I need to disassociate from my authenticity. Because if I don't do that, I might be kicked out of my home. I might be kicked out of my job. I might be shamed. I'm already stigmatized. And so it's this sort of constant battle to survive.
Yeah, you know, and going back, I think dissociation is a very powerful idea because it's sort of kind of a splitting, isn't it? Of the self into different parts and compartmentalizing maybe that authentic part of you and saying, well, that sits there apart from these other parts of me that I can allow myself to express. Because the friend I was talking about from Kenya sometimes says to me, maybe I should just get married and just have a child and then people will get off my back. Or he will say, maybe I should find a lesbian friend and we'll make a marriage of convenience and then people will stop talking. And sometimes my response to him is well, a couple of things come up for me. One, which is, you know, if that's what you need to do to survive, who am I to tell you to do otherwise? Because, you know, survival is necessary. Because, you know, the pressure is relentless. But I sometimes say to him, what kind of relationship would that be that you would have with this person that you marry to satisfy the needs of your family? Would it be a marriage or a relationship of mutuality? Would it be an expression of your highest being, your deepest desires? What about her needs? You know, would she be getting only a part of the intimacy that she deserves as well? in a relationship? What would your children learn about relationships from what they observe about you and your wife? You know, what would they see love? Would they see tenderness? Would they see intimacy? Would they see joy? You know, because we teach our children how to be in relationships by what our relationship is like. You know, and I think when I have that discussion with him, sometimes he says, yeah, okay, I must think about that. But at the same time, survival is a need, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And I'm thinking of people who might be trans, for instance, who,
Yeah,
in order to belong, you know, sacrifice their authenticity, you know, people who are lesbians who do the stuff that you've just been talking about. I'm reminded of when my mom passed away and I went for the funeral in Nigeria. Her pastor said to me, you know, you need to get married to a woman and give your mom a grandchild, otherwise she's not going to rest in peace.
oh wow. No
And
guilt then.
yeah, and I said, well, that's not for me. And he said, well, you know, you have to do it. He said, there are women in church and they will gladly say yes, because many of them simply want to get married and have a child. And what dawned on me is that difference between tolerance and acceptance. And so, because he said to me, he said, look, we know you have a partner, we know you're gay, but you still need to do this because this is the culture. So it goes back to that notion of pale, you know, the things that we do in order to stay within that pale.
Yes. Yeah.
And so what's coming up for me right now is around, there's all that going on. How do we start to navigate healing? How do, you know, the people who are out there, how do they start to navigate healing? How do they start to confront the trauma to the best of their capability and capacity?
Yeah. It's a great question. But almost before I get to it, I just wanted to say your example of the pastor also made me think about the way women are viewed, because it feels quite misogynistic to say, oh, there are plenty of women who'll marry you and have children. It's as if the fullness of their own lives don't really matter. You know, they're objects to be used by you to satisfy the needs of, you know, of respectability, I suppose, and conformity, and your late mom's poor soul, you know, to that it can rest in peace. And it feels like quite unkind to those women, that they're just objects, vehicles for some greater aim. Anyway, that's a sort of a side thought. But on healing, I suppose maybe you can't heal what you haven't named, is a thought that strikes me. And I think part of what this conversation is about is recognizing that as a group of people, we are subjected to harm. And we may find ways to live our lives with varying degrees of success, but in ways that can not recognize the harms that have been done to us as individuals and as a collective. So I think naming it is important. But there's always a risk to that, isn't there? Because once you've named it, what comes alive for you possibly is the feelings that you have dissociated from or suppressed. And so it raises the question of what is a safe space for healing work to happen. There isn't any one path to healing. There's individual work, you know, and I recognize that it's a luxury for many people to have sort of one-on-one psychotherapy. And maybe that model isn't for everybody, because healing can come from connecting with your community and doing healing work for other people. You know, the idea of healing people heal other people, maybe to transpose your earlier comment about hurt people hurting people. So mentoring and caring for other people, like in my case as an older person, I found a lot of satisfaction in affirming the lives and stories of younger queer people. And say, I see you, you know, I love you, I recognize you, I value you, and I'm here for you. is healing for me as well. But I think the arts, creativity, collective endeavors which are generative are things that I think are also potentially healing.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love that. I think back to this moment in my 30s where I kind of knew that I had loads of pain, but I said to myself, I'm going to be different. I'm going to be the one who bypasses therapy, bypasses all this fluffy stuff. It's all in the past. I'm just going to move on.
Yeah.
And then I was in this relationship that ended really badly. And I had this moment where I paused and I was like, I think there's stuff in my past that I need to confront because I keep on repeating these patterns. Like I keep on dating the same type of person. I keep on having the same type of boss at work. I keep on revisiting themes around betrayal, abandonment, shame was coming up. And so I really love that name in it. I really love that name in it. So for me, that started with confronting all the stuff from the past. And that was how I kind of started actually. So at 29, I started keeping a journal. At the time, it was more like a diary, just writing stuff that happened. And at the end of the year, I would read it and I'd be like, oh my goodness, I'm really messed up. But that was really my entry point to pressing pause and actually naming how I was showing up in the world. And I think for many, that can be a very gentle way of starting the healing work. It's like getting out a map and looking at the territory and going, okay, where am I right now? What's going on? I think the other thing tied in with that is around conversations, having those benevolent friends who are not going to judge us, who are not going to shame us. It could be just one person, it could be two people, where we can have the kind of conversation like we're having right now. Where we are being witnessed, we're being heard, we're being seen, we're being listened to. I think that can be really, really powerful. And I think when I was younger, I didn't necessarily have that. I had friends where we would distract each other away from our pain. So we were all disassociated and we would get together and disassociate. So I think a healing process would be, the journaling, the writing, the developing that wholehearted community where we can come together. And it might be something as simple as, let's share some of the stories that have shaped us to be who we are today. And it's not about trying to fix it. It's simply about it's about listening. Because one of my nervousness, and I was a bit concerned about that with our conversation, is it's so easy to want to go immediately to solutions. Let's put a bandage, a plaster on this wound that is festering. And I think we can't do that. We need to go into the past and open up Pandora's box and see what's in there. And so I've really loved the conversation that we're having, which is about looking at the stuff that gets in the way. And so I think that's part of the healing process.
I would agree. I'd imagine, depending on how they edit this interview, the viewer might pick up, which is what I'm feeling, is that there's quite a high level of empathy between you and me, and the sort of resonance in terms of our ability to hear each other. And that is something that is very profound. I mean, you and I have both studied in those fields, but anybody really can learn to be more empathic and to be a better listener. And what you do is you create almost a sacred space, but you have to regard it with a certain amount of sanctity to say, let's trust and put a supportive boundary around this work so that we do hold it. Because I'm mindful of the conversation that I spoke about this morning with the teachers, where the one teacher was very vulnerable and actually cried. And I think she struggled with that because she said, this is very hard for me to be so exposed to my peers in this way. So it is important that we add in the dimension of safety in the work. And the other thought I had that was triggered by your comments was that there aren't always quick fixes. And sometimes the healing journey is a life journey. And so if I go back to my own story about losing my dad, I think one of the things that I learned as a child was that people leave you, people you love leave you in ways that are inexplicable, and that you shouldn't put your trust in a relationship too much because they can be taken away from you. And I think that has had a long-term and profound effect on all my relationships, where I've always held back to some degree. I don't put all of myself into them. And it's sort of like there's always a little bit of an escape clause, Well, I wasn't fully invested in that relationship anyway, so I can put a line underneath it. So that's my work that is ongoing.
Yeah. I'm just trying to dig out a book I had on the table. Because as you was talking, I was like, this quote is perfect. And in this book, which is called Becoming Your True Self, there's a quote that says, healing doesn't mean the damage never existed. It means the damage no longer controls our lives. And I really find that powerful, actually.
Yeah.
So there's something there around, yes, acknowledging, honoring the stuff that was, yes, your dad died at that age. You're doing all this work to sort of meet that pain. And then what happens tomorrow? What happens when you encounter someone? What happens when that person is leaving, when you're saying goodbye? And I can certainly relate to that. I agree. It's a lifelong journey. It's not a quick fix. I used to think it was a quick fix when I first started this. I used to think I'd read that book, that one book, and then I'd be sorted, or I'd go on that one workshop and then I'd be sorted. And I remember saying this to a tutor some years ago. I want to come on this workshop. Can you give me the guarantees that when I leave, by the end of it, I'm going to feel I'm good enough, I'm not broken, I'm not damaged? And he's like, I can't guarantee that. I'm like,
maybe not.
Exactly. And I think it is that lifelong journey. So the other thing that comes up for me is around self-compassion, tied in with that safety. I think being really kind to ourselves, being really gentle with ourselves, becoming that best friend to ourselves. Because I can very easily go into self-judgment, and I'm sure there are many listeners who are probably feeling that same way as well. So cultivating those inner resources, like speaking to ourselves in a kind manner, and then the external resources are going to vary depending on people's means. For instance, like you said earlier on, therapy for some people is not even an option. For some people, it might be they're starting off with something else that feels safe, that feels comfortable. But what I would like to say is each of us needs to find our own way and our own most authentic way. What works for one person might not necessarily work for the other. So in a way, we all have to go on this journey by ourselves. We all need to find our own map.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the individual map and the collective map can overlap.
Oh yeah, definitely.
That they find moments where you find your people and your connections, and you realize that you on a bit of that journey together. You're accompanying each other on the walk of discovery. But I particularly like also your comment about self-compassion, because if you think about the impact of the negativity aimed at LGBTI people, is that you internalize so much shame and so many negative ideas that it is a life's work to get to the point where you can say, I love myself and all my flaws and mixed capabilities and mistakes, and to say, I messed up, but I can get up and do it better again. And I think part of what trauma work is about is also being able to develop those sort of higher order analytical, reflective skills. So we can say, okay, I can see I did it again, but seeing that I did it again is a sign of growth, rather than just doing it unconsciously or instinctively. Being able to see, oh, okay, I messed up. This is why I messed up. I understand it. I can work through it. I can know a bit more about the next time. I think that work is also very important.
Yeah, yeah. I'm conscious that we could speak forever on this theme, and then
The longest interview in living memory.
exactly. And I'm wondering, maybe we share some final thoughts around what we hope those watching, those listening to this will take away from it, and how they can start on their own trauma care and healing journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thought that pops in my head, I'm tempted to say it gets better. You know, I think, was that the Trevor Project or something like that?
Something
It had
like that.
as its tagline. And sometimes the more hard realist part of me says, for some people it doesn't. You know, if we're truly honest, some people live in situations that are really hard. But that growth is possible. The term post-traumatic growth, for example, is used in the literature, that from bad experiences can come something that is generative, that is healing, that builds new connections in your own brain and connections with other people. So healing and growth are possible. And I would say, try your best to seek out work that really fits with you, that feels right for you. I think you know when it feels right. And that you seek out people who have your best interests at heart to help you with your healing.
Yeah, beautiful. I echo everything that you've just said. And what I will add to that is getting to know our bodies, getting to connect with our bodies. And
Lovely.
that's something that I've started to recognize probably over the last 3-4 years. Because when my pain, my trauma kind of started in early years, I just disconnected from my body completely. It's almost like it shut down. So I'd get nervous and I'd be like that. If I remember, my mom used to say to me, why are your shoulders always up? Why are they always stiff? And I just really never made that connection. And it's only as I start to do this work that I start to come home to my body again. So what I would encourage people is finding ways to come home to their body, because the body is a powerful anchor. Going back to what you were sharing earlier on in terms of, you know, those visceral moments within the body. So one of the things I do, and I was doing that earlier today, I just play some music and I dance around, dance around the room. And it's really, yes, it's a way of celebrating, but also it's a way of just grounding myself in the moment. So I would really encourage people to get to know their bodies. And going back to what you were saying around the personal and the collective, I really love that. So there's also the collective movement, you know, so dancing with those people, you know, those benevolent witnesses can also be very, very healing,
Absolutely.
and very, very powerful. So
dance with your people.
dance with your people, dance with your people. And dance as not a way to escape, but dance as a way to ground.
Grounding is very important. In fact, if a lot of the trauma literature talks about the necessity of that work, because a lot of the original trauma was about body experiences, and you need to sort of learn to, as you say, trust your body and be rooted in it in ways that are healing for you.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to speak to some of the coordinators at Pride of Freak to see whether we can have a list of resources attached to this. So hopefully we can do that as well. But yeah, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this rich conversation, Pierre.
Me too. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been really, really beautiful. Thank you so much.
Lovely. Thank you, Ade. I've totally enjoyed this. It's been, yeah, healing.
Yes, I can relate to that, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, and be well.
Thank you. You too.
Okay.
So
Take care
I'll just
then.
pause
Bye.
there. I'll just
We
bye.
pause. Okay. Are we going to debrief?